Welcome to the Massey Dialogues. Bienvenue au dialogue du Collège Massey. Massey College is a place that wants to have good discussions. And today we'll have an excellent discussions on the relationship between the US and Canada, a topic that is always close to our hearts. Massey College, the physical Massey College, is built on Indigenous land, the cherished land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. And we are all grateful for the ability to continue to do our work here. The essence of the Massey Dialogue is about intergenerational and interdisciplinary discussion. So I am very pleased always to welcome a junior fellow, and we'll have Darby Bates, an American studying in Canada. We have the ambassador who will be with us, and I want to say, Ambassador Hillman, I am so delighted that you've agreed to do that. It's wonderful. And then we'll have Professor Sands, who's no stranger to Massey, who was there last year talking about this very issue, and will continue to do that. And he is a senior fellow of Massey College. Let me just give a little bit of background on the ambassador. So Kirsten Hillman was appointed Canada's ambassador to the US in March of 2020. And she served as Canada's acting ambassador since August 2019. Before that, she served as deputy ambassador in Washington from 2017 to 2019. Prior to joining the Embassy of Canada to the United States, she held the position of Assistant Deputy Minister of Trade Agreements, Negotiation Branch at Global Affairs. She oversaw our Canada's trade policy and trade negotiations. She was Canada's chief negotiator for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement Trans-Pacific. She's held numerous positions at home and abroad, and was a senior legal advisor to the permanent mission of Canada to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. She's a lawyer by training. Was as a law degree from McGill and Bachelor of Arts from Manitoba. She worked in the private sector in Montreal and at the Department of Justice. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have you with us. We'll have Darby Bates, who's a junior fellow at Massey College, pursuing her Master's of Science in Physics, where she studies, and I know she's passionate about that, ultra-cold atoms. And she's been wanting to warm them up to understand them better for quite a while. She was born in Princeton and has lived in Arizona for 15 years, finished high school in New Jersey, completed in an amazing 3.5 years, a double major in physics and French studies at Smith College, spent a year in Paris and she was a Fulbright scholar in Paris there, where she studied physics at l'École Normale Supérieure. Merci, Darby, to be here. It's always wonderful to have you. And finally, we'll have Dr. Christopher Sands, who's a senior fellow of Massey College since 2019. He's an American scholar. He holds the U.S. federal appointment as Director of Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's a professor of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. We've had occasion to have him at Massey discussing this very issue. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you. So first, Ambassador, I think I want to give you the floor for a few minutes to explain, to give us a little bit your remarks, your initial remarks.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Nathalie. I'm so happy to be joining you and the Massey College community for this chat this evening. So the title of your session is Communication and Collaboration in Unprecedented Times, which is an excellent title and an excellent topic. And so I'm going to use my few minutes of introduction today to talk a little bit about what the day-to-day work is like here and how we are collaborating as between Canada and the United States. I think that, you know, for the most part, when people are thinking about Canada-U.S., they focus on Ottawa and they focus on Washington. They focus on the administration and cabinet, our leaders, cabinet ministers, and clearly those relationships are very, very important. And they're very strong. Our Prime Minister and the President have a good relationship, and they have a very open line of communication. The Deputy Prime Minister, who is also responsible for Canada-U.S. matters, has a good relationship with the Vice President and many other members of Cabinet, as do other members of our Cabinet with their teams, and me and the White House. I mean, all of that stuff and all of those lines of communication are really good. And I would say that they were largely forged through the difficult and challenging time that we had with the renegotiation of the NAFTA, to be quite honest. That was a hard but important endeavor that required us to kind of dig deep and get to know each other and start to trust each other and learn how to talk to each other. But what I also see from here, and I don't think people probably see this as much in Canada, is that the day-to-day workings, the day-to-day communication and collaboration between our two countries happens literally at thousands of points every single day. So here, our team in DC, we work with Congress, we work on the Hill, we work with institutes like Chris's, we work with the business community, we work with NGOs, we work with regional representatives. We have 12 offices, the Canadian government, across the United States, from Atlanta to LA to Detroit to all over the country, and they are responsible for their regions. And so they deal with governors, and they deal with local issues and businesses, environmental issues, whatever the issue of the day is that impacts Canada and our interests. They're working those networks and building those lines of communication. And then back home, we have our premiers, and we have mayors, and we have business leaders, and we have the arts community, and we have the academic community. I mean, it's a multitude, it's millions of relationships every single day. And all those relationships were put to work, as I said, in renegotiating the NAFTA and creating the CUSMA, which, by the way, little plug, comes into force on Canada Day this year. Okay. Excellent achievement. But also during this COVID time, we have relied on those linkages that we have built very deeply. So everybody knows, and everybody who's listening, I think it goes without saying, that we've been experiencing an unprecedented upheaval, right, in our lives over the past months. And the situation, especially I would say in the early days of the crisis, was ever changing. It was full of unknowns. We had never seen anything quite like this before. It was imperfect information, put enormous pressure on all of our systems, put enormous pressure on our political leadership. There were huge, impactful policy decisions being made every single day, right, at a pace that was, I mean, I've obviously never seen or even really dreamed of it before. And during that time, in the face of all of that, Canada and the US were very close in collaborating on the issues that really mattered. So, for example, the first wave was getting our citizens home, right? You'll all recall flying people home, transiting through each other's countries, all of those cruise ships, many of which were landing in territories here in the United States, and our consuls general were working to get all the Canadians home. But the Americans were helping us. They were putting Canadians on their flights and bringing them back from all over the globe, as we were. And then there was another wave, and it was managing the border, and it was deciding to reduce the traffic on the border in order to be able to get a handle on the health crisis that was happening in our respective countries. And then there was ensuring continued collaboration with respect to supply chains and respect to the movement of people and critical workers back and forth, health workers, agriculture workers, getting masks, we have, and people, again, probably don't really appreciate this, but there was a lot of focus on because we're in Canada, on getting supplies that we needed. But the Americans also rely on Canada for components in the supply chain to manufacture PPEs. And so we had this it wasn't easy at first, but we had ultimately an incredibly successful conversation around, while the US closed its border to all other countries with respect to some of these products, they left them open with us so that we could continue to work in this sort of symbiotic way. There's collaboration on medical, scientific collaboration. There's collaboration on our thinking around the economic recovery. Anyway, every day, lots of communications. And I want to emphasize that because I do think that a lot of focus is on
Just
maybe the negative, and there's a lot of positive. Do you want me to? Yeah,
no,
there's a
no,
lot of.
I agree with this. People always focus on one little piece of news and forget to look at the larger picture. It's so interesting to hear about the dynamic of the relationship. But I wanted to just, so how has it impacted the work, the closing and the continuing closing of the border? Is that, is this a big issue in terms of your work and the capacity of this relationship to continue to build and grow strong?
Well, I actually think that the closing of the border and the way in which we did it back in March kind of set the tone for the collaboration that we've had ever since. So just to give people that are listening a bit of a sense of the scope of this decision, the Canada-U.S. border is almost 9,000 kilometers long. If you have to include Alaska in there, but it's 9,000 kilometers. And there are usually well over 400,000 crossings between our border every single day, right? So it's the busiest border in the world. And it's essential for some workers, it's essential for our economies, it's essential for communities that live halfway, back and forth across the border. It's very, very important in many, many ways. And yet the decision was made on both sides of the border. Look, if we're telling our people to stay home and we're telling them not to travel and we're telling them to as much as possible, isolate within their family unit or isolate themselves, then we have to be saying, if you're not going to go visit your neighbor and your sister, then you shouldn't really be going and visiting next door either, like in your town, right? And that was sort of the crux of it. And the Americans feel the exact same way, right? So the Americans feel that is also perfectly consistent with the way in which they're trying to manage. And when I say Americans, we're talking to the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security. That's how they're also trying to manage the border within their country. So when I say I think it set the tone, what happened was we were able to kind of express our opinions to each other back in March and say, look, we think that the logical extension of our domestic policy is to ensure that commerce can continue between our two countries, but to say to folks, hey, for discretionary travel, for things that don't have to happen, now's not the time, maybe just stay home. And they agreed. And from that conversation to the actual implementation of the decision, it was a matter of days. Yeah. And I think that's remarkable because the impact of that decision, the sort of scope of that decision from a public policy perspective is enormous. And the fact we could do it so quickly, I think shows how well we are able to communicate together.
Well, that's good. Let me talk to someone who is affected by this, who is an American living in Canada, did not go back home, has to stay here. So Darby, you've now lived in Canada for almost 10 months, I think. Any thoughts on any worries that you have about the Canada-U.S. relationship?
From like a public perspective, like on the individual interaction basis, I worry somewhat about like lasting impressions of current decisions and decisions that are being made related to COVID-19, like the attempt to stop the export of masks to Canada from the United States. And I think about how that would perhaps have a lasting effect on those relationships. I'm by no means an expert in any of this, but as a novice kind of person interested in U.S.-Canada relations, with a vested interest in U.S.-Canada relations, that's kind of what I think of first. Ambassador, thank you for your very broad description, and broad but specific description of what's going on at the government level, and mentioning the kind of thought that goes into those border closings. Because as a student who is away from home and kind of stuck away from home for a while, those border closings seem like a scary thing in that I know students are classified as essential workers, so if I were to go home, I would be able to come back. But the impact of needing to self-isolate for 14 days on either end of any trips home is non-negligible. And I also consider the long-term impact of the border closings on industries like tourism between the two countries, and lasting impacts beyond the end of COVID-19 when that stops being a force that's pushing for such border closures. And I also hope for continued future relationships of exchanging students and exchanging workers for kind of an increased mutual cultural understanding between Canada and the United States on kind of a broader societal level. And
were there things that surprised you about living in Canada from the U.S.? Does that color your appreciation of you had lived in France, but now you're living in Canada? Is that did you learn something that you did not know and that you think there's not good enough communications about that between the two countries?
Well, there's so much to learn about Canada as a young American student here. On an individual level, my academic work is kind of similar no matter where I am, but the context of it, so the culture surrounding where I am and my interactions day to day with people on the street or other people in my lab in more of a personal context, is unique to wherever the location is. And I am still learning all sorts of things about Canadian culture and art and music and history. And I really strongly appreciate living at Massey and being able to kind of be surrounded by so many people who have diverse fields of study, but also diverse backgrounds, to be able to kind of expose one another to different cultures and art. And there was one particularly fun evening that was hosted by the physics department where they did a trivia night virtually a couple weeks ago. And one of the topics of a section of the questions was fun facts about specific provinces and territories in Canada. And so it was really cool to hear all of the different diverse questions that the person running the trivia came up with. And
so I take it that
similarities.
You almost won. And bringing Chris a little bit about, so this border crossing, the closing the border has, a psychological impact. It was, people would understand why it was done. I think now that there's some reopening, are there some issues that Canadians should worry about or should think about as we look to the next year?
Well, yes and no. I think what I would start with is to recognize just how remarkable the cooperation has been. These things don't come from nowhere, and Herbert Simon used to say that the one inexhaustible and yet finite resource is our attention. And in this internet age, we get this sort of explosion of a news headline that comes in on our machines, and then we forget. We don't really think about how we got there, and we certainly don't follow up. So Darby mentioned the masks that were not supposed to be exported to Canada. And for me, this is all a wonderful social experiment. There was this message to 3M, don't send the masks. There was 3M's response. There was back and forth. And what ultimately happened in a way that almost no one would see, except if you are a nerd about the relationship like me, is that the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency inside DHS, which is responsible for implementing Defense Production Act restrictions, which are what 3M was threatened with, issued in rulemaking a specific exemption for medical and other goods destined for use in Canada and Mexico. And that is a reflection of the border cooperation and the supply chains that Ambassador Hillman mentioned. In any crisis, and we saw this at Hurricane Katrina, we've seen this in other big disasters, 9/11, there's trial and error. And I think leaders come out and they say, well, we've never seen anything like this before. Are there some analogs? Can we try this and that? And what impresses me is that maybe our first impulse on these decisions isn't right, but how quickly we've been able to get back on track. I'll give you another example that really struck me. You may remember the furor when the reports were the U.S. was going to send troops to the Canadian border. And, people say, oh my gosh, it's an invasion. But really, it was an attempt to try to backstop the Border Patrol with National Guard in the U.S. But within a day, within the news cycle, communication took place. Both sides understood what was going on better, and the U.S. decided to think the better of that approach, and everyone was able to go back to normal. But I think the good and the bad of living in our time is that the shock headline gets our attention, but the hard work of fixing things doesn't always. Mm-hmm. Maybe one more example, because I can't resist it, especially with Ambassador Hillman here, and that is the Canada-U.S. Mexico agreement, the new replacement for NAFTA. I still run into people, including my parents, who say, well, now that that's done, what are you going to talk about? And I'm like, well, it's not really done. It won't take effect until Canada Day. And then, even though it was negotiated, we're going to have to live with it. And what we saw with NAFTA and Canada-U.S. free trade is there's a lot of fine-tuning and recognition of things that could be done better or have to be fixed. And what really excites me about this agreement is we built in a review in 6 years, so that unlike NAFTA, which we apparently finished with the intention that it would be forever, maybe a bit foolish, we now have planned that we're going to do some upgrades and updates just like we would with other software. And I think, or other things that we rely on, it just was too important to make it static. So I look at the relationship, and while it's true we have some challenges, I'm just impressed as heck by Ambassador Hillman and all the hardworking people who have actually tinkered with it and found solutions, and despite the sometimes scary news, have kept us on track.
Well, let's bring all together then. So we're appreciative that by and large things are working in the right direction. I assume that the implementation of the new agreement will take up a lot of time on all the people that you described that work so hard around the country to maintain that relationship. Are there particular issues that we should know about, that we should think about as we progress in this implementation phase? Ambassador Hillman.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think what I would say is that the agreement is like a foundation, right? A trade agreement really does two things. It liberalizes markets and creates preferential relationships, so we incentivize trading with each other and investment in each other's countries. And it creates stable rules that companies can count on for the same reason. Companies and investors can count on these rules will endure through time, and they can take some risks. But it's just the foundation. The actual activity has to happen. And so the big job now is for us as facilitators to make sure that in all three countries, our industries understand the rules that are available to them, the opportunities that are available to them, and we try to design or to provide them information and incentives to further deepen and strengthen our trilateral relationship. And there's an interesting statistic that I saw a couple of years ago, which shows that when countries negotiate together, in particular economic agreements, even before those agreements enter into force, we see business and investment growing in the region. And that's because business knows that governments have taken the decision to sort of invest in the non-monetary sense, in the sort of political sense, invest in each other and invest in the region. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be focusing on now, and making, especially now more than ever, right? Because all three of our countries were facing a huge health disruption, but it's also an economic and a social disruption that is massive. And we need all of the sort of lines of partnership that we can to sustain each other. If I were to summarize, and thanks to Chris for the examples, because I think those are the illustrations of exactly what I'm trying to talk about. If I were to summarize what's happening in the Canada-U.S. relationship in particular right now, is that there is a recognition that we are facing an unprecedented challenge globally from a health, social, economic perspective, and locally, domestically, right down to every sort of town and village. And that governments need to react to support their people. But at the same time, it's a global problem and you can't go it alone. And so if you're going to go forth in this uncertainty and disruption with someone, who do you go forth with? You go forth with those who you trust the most, who you know the best, who you're the most integrated with, who share, your interests and values and all that good stuff. And I think that's the moment in time in which we find ourselves right now. And so that, plus the USMCA coming into force, is an incredible opportunity for Canada, US, and Mexico. There's tons of challenges in the road ahead. Don't get me wrong, but it's a really important opportunity if we look at it through that lens.
Because often I think the COVID crisis, people, say it will force us to be far more protective. It will create a little bit of I don't want my neighbors, and I certainly, go back to protecting your borders more, and a different ethos in decision making on the public side, but on the private sector. So what you're telling us is that we hope that that's not going to happen in the context of Canada, US, and Mexico because of the agreement. And I'd like to hear your perspective a little bit. Maybe let's start with Chris, and then I'll get back with the.
Maybe if I could just add some context in a particular way. The United States closed its border with China. It closed its border with the European Union. And we've been talking about closing the border between Canada and the US, but in truth, we jointly restricted the border. And I know that sounds like it's, semantics, but it is really significant. This was not something the US did or Canada did by themselves. From the beginning, the restriction was cooperative. And we share a tremendous amount of data about crossing. And we were able to say, essential traffic can continue. That on 9/11, obviously that was September 11th, was a shocking event. I'm sure, Darby, you were quite small. But when that happened, the border shut because people didn't know what was going on. They couldn't estimate the risk. There was just unknowns, too many unknowns. But because we had the NORAD agreement, Canada and the US closed airspace together. So air defense had advanced. We had institutions, etc., but border defense had not. This time, it wasn't a question of closing the border. And we've seen 80 to 85% of the truck traffic crossing in Detroit and Buffalo, and the economy has kept going. And when I think about where we would be if the cross-border economy had shut down, if Canada was cut out of our supply chains across North America, this would be an economic disaster, more than just a recession, a depression. And I think that's a testament to how far we've come working together. And I think maybe just so often we kind of say, and you hang around international people and say, oh, well, Canada, US, you guys are kind of cousins. And so it's kind of an exception to international relations. It is, but it's also a remarkable achievement in international relations. And so many other countries around the world could look at what Canada has done and maybe better understand how to cooperate with the US. There's a respect there that goes between officials on both sides that's made this so successful. And we sometimes think, this is affecting all of us, but Canada and the US have actually really accomplished something in this crisis. There is a bright side.
Yeah, well, thank you for this. Actually, I want to bring in Darby because I think part of the future and this expansion of opportunities that the ambassador talked about will be about also on science, cooperation, we hope on university cooperation. Do you see this as, you chose to come here, but is that because you thought, oh, well, I could go anywhere? And is there an advantage in do you see the advantage of the new agreement, for example, for the future of research for you?
Well, our lab in particular is already collaborating with several groups in the United States at a couple different institutions, and I see this kind of global collaboration between the United States and Canada as only promoting more collaborations between groups, which will, of course, further research and further opportunities for development of new technologies and further scientific understanding. I feel strongly that international collaboration, especially in scientific research, but also in humanities and social sciences, is essential, and that the strengthening connections between the United States and Canada can only strengthen those fields.
Because we need to understand, we need a vibrant and thoughtful research sector on both sides of the border. There's two questions that I have. The first one is, obviously the essence of the agreement is that Mexico is part of the equation. So it's not only developing a good, interesting, and solid, trustworthy relationship with the US, but also having the same respect, trust with Mexico. Is that something that you worry about, Ambassador, when you think about how will the future look like in this economic recovery? When we think about, it's not only Canada-U.S., like it's the entire North American continent. Bigger opportunities, challenges?
I think yes to both. I think there's no doubt that the North American relationship from an economic perspective is advantageous to Canada and the US because we have Mexico. It is a very important partner in our trilateral relationship. And I think that they're in a different place than we are in terms of some aspects of their economy and their development, economic development, but it's an incredibly vibrant and rich country. And so I do think that they bring the trilateral relationship is essential. And you have to remember, and Chris can speak to this probably as an American or Darby more than I can, but if you go into the southern part of the United States, the relationship with Mexico is essential to the sort of lives and the psyche of people as it would be if you lived in, Windsor and Detroit. I mean, this is a very, very, very close personal, family, historical relationship, just as the Canada-U.S. relationship is. We happen to have the U.S. in the middle. So for Canada, that our relationship to Mexico is economic, and it's a great place to go when it's really cold up north. But and it's a relationship that we need to foster more. But yes, I think they're very important. I think that there are challenges in addition for coming out of COVID, just because we're all going to face important economic challenges, including Mexico. Can I just jump in on? Can I jump back on something else? So you were asking Darby about academic cooperation, and I want to tell you, somebody gave me this in advance of our call, and I think it's so super cool. I've got a bunch of examples, but these are examples of academic cooperation between Canada and the U.S. in relation to COVID that are happening right now. Okay, I'm gonna give you a couple. So in the area of gender, Simon Fraser University in BC and Johns Hopkins are working on a gender analysis of the COVID-19 outbreak and trying to understand COVID from a gender perspective. Laval, Quebec, the Université de Laval in Quebec, and the University of Massachusetts Amherst are studying misinformation and COVID and how the spread, mainly through online platforms, has led to the mistrust of public institutions and what that is doing from a public health perspective. We've got, obviously, and people talk about this a lot, U of T and Arizona State, right, are doing a lot of work on testing and the science around that. But I think some of these other areas, the social impact of this, I think are super interesting. There's a Regina, Saskatchewan, the University of Saskatchewan in Regina, and Baylor University in Texas, and Fordham, I guess, in New York City. So it's a three-way project looking at the psychological factors of the pandemic's growth and the impact on societies. Anyway, there's a ton of super interesting stuff. And I think that kind of work also, because we've lived this experience together, right? And so studying it together, understanding it together, going back to Chris's point, kind of learning from it together. Can we do better next time? God willing, no next time. But what can we do? I think is really, really important. And so hats off to all these, and I'm sure there's many other things going on that haven't made it to my little cheat sheet here, but it's just really fantastic. It's really fantastic. And those are like the people to people ties, right? That keep our relationship strong.
Well, that's to do good cooperation. You need to be able to talk to each other, and obviously you can talk on Zoom and on Skype and so on. But eventually you may need to cooperate. I think we've lived this for the next 3 weeks. I mean, the other big transformative aspect is anti-Black racism issues and the response that both countries will need to develop. Any areas of cooperation there, or any areas that you think we should be? People are very concerned about that. Many people are very concerned about what's going on in the States and the impact that it can have both on the U.S. and marginalized people, but also its impact more generally around the world. Chris, can you help us understand a little bit here?
Well, I think this builds on what Ambassador Hillman was saying. There's a huge opportunity for us to study these problems together. In the case of George Floyd, we have a bad cop, a cop who went too far. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was training. What drove that? But the majority of our police are doing their best in tough circumstances. We do have some people in both countries that have racist attitudes, but I've been impressed at how many people really were touched by this in both countries and united, even willing to come out at some risk of the pandemic to make their voices heard against racism. And it all depends on your perspective, but from one perspective, we're divided. It's Canadians versus Americans, African Americans versus non-African Americans, all that. But we actually are remarkably united on both sides of the border against pandemics, for reopening the economy, for trying to find ways to address historic racism and discrimination. And Principal, you actually raised the issue of First Nations in Canada. That's something that we've been working through in the U.S. as well, and I think you're further ahead than we are. But with these divisions, once you start actually getting data, understanding the problem, and finding ways in good faith to work together, I think there's no end of what you can do. And now I'm going to bring it back to trade. I know you'll wince, but one of the things this has shown a lot of people, this episode, these last few months has shown a lot of people, is just how dependent we are on each other through supply chains for the production of a range of goods, even research supply chains where different people in different labs are sharing data. That was invisible to most people in North America up until recently. Even now, they're not sure where it is. But we're starting to map those supply chains, understand them better, figure out how to support them. And I find that one of the problems for both economies right now is uncertainty. What will the trade rules be? When will COVID be over? When can we get back to work? And it's dampened investment. It's slowed employment. We're all kind of finding our way through. But the fundamentals are so significant, and our capacity to understand these problems is so great. I feel that once we start solving some of the uncertainty, we did that with USMCA, we are going to solve it with the uncertainty of the border and eventually, hopefully, a treatment or a vaccine for COVID. Once that uncertainty goes, we'll have a huge potential to boom in our cooperation and work together more closely. So I just feel like we're in a really good place despite all the bad news. There's more good news out there.
Well, but yes, go ahead, Ambassador, and then I
was just gonna. I know you're probably gonna go to questions in a minute, so I just wanted to, before you did that, I just did want to jump in on your comment around the protests taking place both in the U.S. and in Canada and around the world. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that I personally, I really admire the people that are bringing these issues forward in a very clear way in our country, but here in the U.S., where really it's what's been happening here in the United States that I think has lit a fire to a lot of really essential conversations in many places, including Canada. And I would also say, just for everyone's information, that this is super powerful, and it's also really deeply felt here by our Canadian network here in Washington and across across the country, because all of these protests, of course, are happening all across the country. So it's being felt both by the Canadians in our organization, who know that racism and systemic racism is also a problem in our country and are seeing the impact that this is having on our conversations and protests in Canada. But it's also really powerful and deeply felt here because about half of our employees here in the United States are American. And so and many of them are Black Americans. And so we are feeling it within our sort of Government of Canada family as well. And it's very important. And anyway, I didn't want to let this topic go by without saying that it is very front of mind for us and all of my team here in the US. And hopefully we can learn from each other and, and listen to what everybody has to say and move forward with some action.
So everybody has said that we've had on the Massey Dialogue that COVID presents an opportunity for change, that we may not go back to the new normal. It's an opportunity to, and there will be some changes, certainly I think on elder care, maybe there will be some change in the way in which work is organized. Darby, what do you think are the key things that you'd like to see out of the transformation maybe that COVID has brought to our society?
One of the things that I appreciate is that even though certain meetings or large-scale meetings like conferences couldn't happen in person, that they still happened online virtually. And I think that because those events were online, there was actually more access to them than there would have been under previous circumstances. And so I would hope that groups and committees that are organizing such events in the future will consider having online resources for individuals who are maybe in another country or in another time zone, where they're also able to participate in those exchanges and benefit from them. So the one that comes to mind for me is recently there was a large physics conference called DAMOP, which took place as it would have in person but online. And rather than only being able to send one student to attend the conference, the entire group was able to go and benefit from hearing those presentations and participating in those conversations. So I would hope that the lasting impact of the response to COVID-19 right now, where everyone's kind of forced to work away from like a normal schedule, is that we will have continued reinforced remote opportunities for people.
And can I pick up on that? That's one of the things we've been talking about at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We've traditionally had internships, especially in the summer, different times of year, opportunities for young people to come, do some policy research, experience working with our scholars in a diverse set of areas. But to be honest, the people who we've often had were people whose parents could afford to pay their rent for an apartment in DC, which is not a cheap town. They could afford to come and do this for the summer rather than working, a job at home. And there was always, not intentionally, a privilege aspect of that. And one of the things we've realized this summer and going into the summer is that teleworking can allow a remote internship. You have to think about how you construct that so that it really is of value, but that can create an opportunity for someone who doesn't have the financial means but has the desire to learn more about how Washington works and how policy research is done. And so it's not a perfect comparison. The live experience is probably a little better in some ways, and we still haven't mastered remote internships, but I see this as a huge area for us to bridge some of the gaps and the disadvantages that students in different parts of North America have, and give them a window on how decisions are made and incorporate them into our work.
That's great.
Well, actually, we see this right now. The Massey is online, which it had not been before, and we're able to talk to both of you, which probably would have been harder if we were not reimagining ourselves in the COVID time. Now, I am, up to now, you've all said kind of, well, things are going pretty well. It looks as though the relationship is so well anchored in a way that it should be pretty smooth sailing. Aren't they a couple things that you're a little bit worried about that could happen on the horizon? And then I'm going to ask you as well to think about what can Canadians and academics do to maintain or kind of continue to anchor this relationship. But first, anything that keeps you up at night, Ambassador?
For sure. So I think, look, I'm trying to put on the table what people don't see every day, what doesn't grab the headlines every day, which is frankly a relationship that is working well for both of our countries. And a moment in time where if we handle it correctly, I think we can actually come out of this with a stronger partnership. It was strong going in, and I think that's why things are working well. And I think it can be even stronger coming out. But we don't agree on everything, right? Canada and the United States. And we won't agree on everything going forward. And that won't matter who is Prime Minister of Canada and who is the President of the United States. We will not agree on everything. And so we have to watch for that. And we have to nurture all of those relationships so that when we don't agree, we can kind of make it through and get to the other side and still do all of the other things that we have to do where we do work together. So that's a sort of a general question. Specifically, what worries me? You kind of alluded to it earlier. I think that in any time of economic recovery, when we're trying to really get our economies back on track, all governments have already, our government and your government have already provided a lot of incentives to businesses and industry to keep them afloat. And we will have other things in place to get our economies back on track. And that's normal. And that's what has to be done in these times. I think that there is always a risk when that happens that we don't take account of each other. And probably more often, the US doesn't take account of Canada. And maybe structures some of its programs in ways that cut our supply chains unintentionally, or maybe intentionally, right? Like it could be both. So we really do have to continue to make sure that people understand, decision makers understand why that is not in our overall interest, and why, as partners, why that is not in the U.S. interest, what it is that we've created, and the consequences of undermining it. I think that is it's like constant vigilance on that topic. I also think that for both of our countries and for the world, frankly, I don't think that we're not at the end of COVID. I'm not even sure we've got a ways to go. And I think that if we want to support our communities and we want to support the health of our people and we want to support our economies, then we also have to be very cautious with how we move forward in handling the pandemic. And I do think that is something that globally is going to be handled differently by different countries. And it's something to watch for, because I think that it can cause. And I think, if we don't take care of ourselves and the U.S. doesn't take care, if we're not doing what we need to do, we're not going to be able to help some of the poorest countries in the world, frankly, who I think are going to be suffering the very most from this. Or we're not going to be able to be devoting as much time and attention to our economies or our scientists or whatever. We need to make sure that we stay vigilant.
Chris, any comments on this? Anything that could cloud the rosy picture that you presented a bit?
Well, some of that is dispositional, and I promise you it's not drugs or anything. I'm just a happy guy. But if there's something that bothers me, and I say this as somebody who spends a lot of time with American policymakers thinking about, obviously, Canada, it's how uncertain the U.S. is now about where Canada fits in. And I worry, as the ambassador worries, that Americans are sort of missing a Canadian perspective. They don't even think to ask for it. I'll give you an example that comes to mind right away, and that is China. The United States and China have a lot of issues that they're working out. That rivalry that conflict is reshaping international politics. There is not at this stage a certainty as to where that's going to go. There's certainly some dangers there that it could get worse. And I find that there are too few American policymakers who understand that Canada is caught not in the middle, you're definitely on a side, but that you are facing fallout from this conflict. Not only that, that you have something to bring to the table that could actually help the United States. Too few Americans know Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig's names, and they don't know that they may have heard that Meng Wanzhou is in Vancouver waiting to be extradited. What they may not know is that Canadian farmers are suffering because they're not able to sell canola and other products because of a trade conflict with China. What they may not know is that there are more than 300,000 dual passport holders, Canadian and Hong Kong, who are in the middle of this very tense situation in Hong Kong, and that there are so many Canadians who speak Chinese and have Chinese heritage and Chinese business connections. Canada should be our partner in China, and it's a criticism of this administration, but I think it's often true for American administrations. During the Cold War, I think American foreign policy was very good at partnering with middle powers, understanding that there was a give and take. And as much as we've talked today about the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Canada, third country issues where we work together abroad, whether it was in Haiti or in Europe or now on China, is often some of the real fruitful side of our partnership. And I'm not sure that the United States now has the strategic thinking and understanding of Canada. And you can blame me. I mean, I'm here trying to be the Canada guy. I've got to talk more, do more talks. But I think that's what keeps me up at night. That something will happen that isn't between us, because that works fine, but that will alienate Canadians and Americans because we just don't see the world in the same way. And in particular, because I try to be patriotic American, that we won't put our best foot forward because we didn't listen to the advice of a good friend like Canada. So more listening from us. That's what keeps me up at night.
Darby, anything that keeps you up at night when you think about the future of the relationship between the two countries and
No.
That's good. Answer. That shows that there is, for somebody that's done it, that is working. She's in a good place. But this is interesting to think about multilateralism today. Obviously, when Canada doesn't make it to the Security Council, but there is a certain, my last question is this: what can Canadians who are listening, and academics who are listening to this debate about and care about a healthy relationship, not just for self-interest, but also for the future of many endeavors that are dear to our hearts. What could they do? What could they do to ensure the continuity of the trusting relationship? And if you have something, Ambassador, about the multilateralism and the cooperation outside of just the Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., it'd be helpful to hear from you, Ambassador.
Thank you. I think Chris's point on multilateralism and working together in larger groups is a very well taken, and I think that that's something that deserves more attention. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't had as much attention in recent years is because we have had this, amazing challenge and important task of renegotiating the NAFTA. But now that we are moving forward with that, it is time to be looking at other things. And I think that we could be the U.S. has concerns with certain international organizations, and some of those concerns we share. We may not agree on, how the U.S. is expressing its dissatisfaction or the consequences of that, but we are certainly able to try and work with them to achieve some of the changes that they're looking for. So I think that is definitely true. And I think the China point is a very interesting one. I would say that anytime I raise the issue of the Michaels with any U.S. lawmaker, most of them are aware. I think that it's a question of okay, so what's the plan, right? I mean, I think that's, and so I wouldn't want the listeners to think that the U.S. administration and even, lawmakers on the Hill are not willing and ready to help us with this challenge. It's just, it's a complicated situation.
Yeah.
And you had another question, and I think it was, what can people do? Okay, yeah. What can people do? Look, I believe that the ability of someone like me to do what I do, of our government to do what it does in the Canada-U.S. relationship, whether that's a bilateral issue or us working together in other fora, frankly, it rests on the back of all of the different ways in which our two countries are working together. I believe that we're able to do what we do because there is such a tightly knit series of linkages between people from, all walks of life. And so what I would say is focus on that, right? Focus on what we can do together. Focus on your American friends and your American partners and your American colleagues and your American collaborators, and just do stuff and get stuff done and build partnerships and build common visions and do stuff, because that is what will help us create an atmosphere where we know that we're more than just neighbors. We know that it's more than just sharing a border, but we are actually two societies that are deeply integrated in complex ways and in incredibly mutually beneficial ways. So that's what I think. Get out there. Get out there.
Yeah, get out there.
Do stuff.
Well, indeed, we had a conversation, Massey Dialogues, about cultural diplomacy. How the arts sector contributes in understanding and so on, and is often a way into places where other conversations are harder to have. But I'd like to have a little bit, as we conclude our hour, whether there's some, concluding remarks that you may want to give so that people remember something from our dialogue. So, Darby, do you want to start? What are your last words on this,
Well, I know that there's so much more for me to learn about the existing and future U.S.-Canada relationship, and I would hope that other people would take away the possibility or the benefits of collaborating between multiple countries on business level, on personal levels, taking advantage of educational exchanges or remote internships and things like that will build personal connections to individuals across borders.
That's great.
Thank you.
Also,
Chris?
Yeah, bear with me on this thought, but I think one of the great experiments we're undertaking between Canada and the United States is one of integration. And if you go back a generation in the United States, the word integration was typically associated with bringing African Americans into the mainstream of the economy and communities and ending segregation, and also bringing women into the workforce. And from those two great social experiments, which were very messy in the United States, of course, what we saw was a sort of process. It begins with hostility, then it becomes the joke about, how women are, or how African Americans are, and then the joke becomes, well, we don't mean you, Pete, or we don't mean you, Natalie, who's right here. The exception for the person I know, because the generalization doesn't work for you. And then it finally becomes not funny anymore, because there's no value in those broad generalizations that are so inaccurate. The same thing is happening to Canadians and Americans now, and we have to not be afraid of complexity and not rely on lazy stereotypes that Americans in the place between the coasts are gun-loving, Bible-thumping, people, or there's a Trump voter cartoon that we have in our head. I think we really need to embrace the rich diversity of both of our societies, understand there's no simple template for what a Canadian and what an American or what a Mexican is and their attitudes, and embrace that. I think that's where the younger generation already is and where we all have to get. And there's a similarity in this process of integration. We know how it works. We just ought to learn from that and move quickly to the more tolerant, open-minded way of being that we've accomplished in some areas, even though we have a ways to go. And anyway, that's my attempt to link trade and social upheaval and Canada-U.S. relations all in one.
And jokes.
And jokes. Yes.
Yeah, so, Ambassador, the last word to you.
Well, thanks. I think my pep talk was kind of my last word, in the sense that my main message that I think I want to leave people with is that the Canada-U.S. relationship is so much bigger than any one issue, any one relationship between any two individuals, between any one period in time or government in our country and administration here. And it truly does derive from the multitudes of ways in which we work together every day. And I do think that we need to recognize the huge benefit that both of our countries have by having each other as neighbors. I mean, there are very few countries in this world that have the degree of peacefulness and lack of conflict historically over the entire history of both of our nations, except for one little skirmish, that we have, right? And we need to not take that for granted. We need to say, well, because of that, we have been allowed to focus on other things and to focus on integrating our economies, our culture, our people, our arts communities, our academic communities, and good for us. And let's not squander that good geographic good fortune. Let's make sure we make the very most of it.
Merci. Thank you so much. And thank you to all three of you for your contribution and to enlighten, because I worry at night about the Canada-U.S. relationship. So that was important and reassuring to hear you. So thank you to my guest. It was a real pleasure to have you. I want also to thank the staff at Massey for putting on these dialogues, Matt Glenfield and Abra Rosy. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for doing this. And advertise that next week we have our last Massey Dialogue, which is going to be 10 years after the G20, the evolution of policing. So I look forward to talking to you next Thursday.